I wanted to mention a little bit about the origins of EFT. And one of the odd things about EFT is that people talk about EFT and also about thought field therapy, out of which EFT grew, as though these therapies just landed from a spaceship in the 70s or the 80s and they just appeared. And that's actually far from true. They have very deep roots in the field of psychology. And there are some big milestones in psychology, in the field of psychology. Of course, the Greeks talked about psyche as what we think of as spirit or soul. And they believed that there was an integration between our spiritual side, our soul side, and our physical side, and our mental side. They didn't make the same distinctions that we make. The big advance that is often thought of as the start of experimental psychology occurred in Leipzig in the 1870s, when a German by the name of Wilhelm Wundt established a laboratory and began to actually do animal experiments. And it's curious that his students were very, very aware of the links between psychology and physiology. So at the very beginning of the start of the field of modern psychology, there was real awareness of the holistic links. In fact, his students called this holistic psychology. Then Freud came along in the last part of the 1900s, 19th century, 1800s, and he really focused on the idea of the unconscious. And he gave us this whole concept that there were unconscious drives that were determining our behavior. So we might think we do something for a certain reason, but often there's a subconscious aspect anchored to a childhood experience that is driving that behavior. His colleague Carl Jung said, if you ask a man if he loves his mother, he will tell you how he treats his wife. So Jung realized again this way in which we play out old experiences in our current relationships. Then along came some central figures in the early part of the 20th century, and especially Pavlov in Russia. And his experiments with dogs became famous, where he'd teach the dog to associate ringing of a bell with the delivery of food. So the dog would start to salivate when the bell and the food were delivered in anticipation of the food. He'd then take away the food and just ring the bell, and the dog would still salivate. So this helped us start to understand conditioned responses, that certain responses we have are conditioned by factors outside of our awareness. B.F. Skinner then came along. B.F. Skinner was inspired by Pavlov, and he looked at the whole issue of behavior as chunks, and he broke down behaviors, complex behaviors, into little components. So he said that don't just look at the entire behavior, look at all the elements of that behavior. And the behaviorists under B.F. Skinner became the dominant force in American psychology in the 1940s, 50s. But then along came people like Viktor Frankl after World War II, and especially Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers' approach was called client-centered therapy or patient-centered therapy, where he actually had people focus on the client's experience. So it wasn't just the behavior that was important, it's what's happening for that person in their inner world. How are they healing? And what's the effect especially of just sitting with somebody sympathetically and listening to them? And most people have never been heard. Hari talks about how in San Quentin, working with life sentence prisoners, just sitting there and listening to them is really critical. So all of those threads came together in the last part of the 20th century, and a therapist called Roger Callahan at one point had a client who had a phobia of water, and he had just read a textbook on acupuncture, and so he was listening to his client talk about her fear of water, and he knew that this point over here under the eye was linked to that phobia. Well, he suspected it might be, so he had her tap on this point under her eye. And she came back for the next session and she said, oh, I got over my phobia of water. Now this sounded way too good to be true, that someone with a lifetime phobia could get over it by tapping a few times on one point. But he began to experiment and play with this, and sure enough, he discovered that different points were good for getting over different kinds of problems. And so the whole field of thought field therapy then began to use this tapping technique to do these sorts of shifts. Then Roger's student, Gary Craig, who's an engineer by training, said, let's see if we can't simplify the thought field therapy routine. Because in thought field therapy, Roger Callahan would test you with energy testing or muscle testing to see if your arm went weak or strong for a certain point. And then he would tap on a point, then muscle test you again, maybe try another point, try a combination of points. And he called these combinations of points algorithms. So you had to find the right algorithm to treat a client, and he would test it using muscle testing or energy testing. Gary Craig then said, you know, there are only 12 points. And on the sheet here, you'll see there are just these few points. And Gary said, well, it only takes 30 seconds to tap all 12 points. So rather than doing an hour's worth of testing to figure out which point is the real one, let's just tap them all and see what happens. And lo and behold, for most people, just tap all the points, and maybe only one's really active, but that gives the relief. And also, we're using elements of behaviorism, because we're breaking things down into their small components. So, for example, we saw yesterday how someone tells a whole story that's full of grief and trauma, and then we tap on the whole story, and then we find an element in the story that's particularly troubling. We tap on that. In one example, a survivor of a massacre in Kosovo received thought field therapy. And what had happened was this: when the Serbians took over this town in Kosovo, they rounded up all the men and the boys, they took them into a building and they shot them. And one man survived. He was in the middle of the group, and the bullets hit other people. He was knocked down, but he lay there, and the Serbians thought they were all dead and left. But one man survived. He actually ran into the hills and hid. And so when the therapists were working on him for this traumatic memory, they were tapping on not just the massacre, not just losing all his friends, not just the grief of it, but also on things like the color of the Serbian army's uniforms. And there he is lying covered in blood, looking up at the ceiling. So he's looking up at the ceiling, and the patterns of the wood beams, they tap on that aspect of the trauma. So like B.F. Skinner would break down behavior into many different components, with EFT, you look at every aspect. These are called aspects of the problem. And you tap on each aspect and find the emotionally traumatic aspects of the experience and tap on those. And sometimes people will tell you about terrible trauma, and what you think about maybe the most troubling aspect should be isn't the most troubling aspect. But you'll find some little detail is really emotionally evocative, so you tap on that. So, and again, it's client-based, it's client-centered, like Carl Rogers advocated. So we aren't sitting there with a score sheet saying, I'm working on you, I think you're getting better now. We're asking the person, are you getting better now? And they're telling us, my pain's going from an 8 to a 4, or my emotional intensity is going from a 7 to a 3, or a 1, or whatever it is. We're asking them, we're testing them constantly. We're asking them what they think. This is a highly client-centered approach. And it's also a peer-to-peer approach. You can do it with me, I can do it with you. And I don't have to assume the role of the all-knowing authority. I don't really know what's happening with you. I'm asking what's happening with you. You're asking what's happening with me. And we're highly respectful of each other's experience, of the messages from our bodies, and we're tuned into each other in a way in which we aren't. So we avoid the kind of power dynamics inherent in many other kinds of relationships, where one person's the expert, and I will now tell you what to do to heal. We're listening to the other person. We're highly respectful of their story. So that's how this builds in elements of Wilhelm Wundt's work, linking the mind and the body in Leipzig, how we look for buried issues from childhood, the way Freud showed us was so vital to uncover the roots of our present behavior. That's why we look for our conditioned responses. Why do I always feel this way? Okay, there's an emotional trauma that's propelling your behavior. Let's go and tap on that. So we're looking for those hidden, buried traumas and those conditioned responses that Pavlov showed us that we all have. And like B.F. Skinner showed, breaking down behavior into little chunks, we look at all the aspects of a problem, but do so, like Carl Rogers said, based on a client-centered approach, not with me as the expert. And then, whereas behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and exposure therapy have you focusing on the problems, EFT also adds the element of tapping or somatic stimulation, which helps tell the body that you're safe. And when we say, I love and accept myself, that's a cognitive shift. So we're making a cognitive shift. We're saying that even though I have this problem, that's part of what's called exposure, psychological exposure. You have to remember the problem. But then you say the self-acceptance statement, even though I have this problem, I deeply and completely accept myself. And I'm going to tell you, yesterday I was telling you to say that, and you were saying, I deeply and completely accept myself. Today you're saying, I deeply and completely accept I believe you now when you say that, because I can see the expressions on your faces that this has already shifted for you in the last while. And so this is how EFT brings in all these elements that have been present in the history of psychology and incorporates them into this really simple little package that very reliably reduces trauma. And I emphasize this just to show you that this isn't some sort of thing that just appeared and some mysterious technique. It really has its roots in all the things we've learned about how mind and body work together, about how people change over the course of the last century and a half of psychological history.